Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is the Vulgar Marxist. I have for some time promised you a Paul Krugman video and have been recalcitrant to do it not because of any personal concern about addressing Mr. Krugman's arguments, which are frankly threadbare, but because I simply haven't had the time. The last week, I think I've gone through last 2 weeks, I've gone through 7 different trucks in about 10 days because of breakdown after breakdown after breakdown. So it is significantly later than I would have liked that I'm going to be able to bring you this video. That said, this evening we will be listening to a portion of a discussion between Paul Krugman and Ezra Klein. I would love to be able to do the entire discussion. His thoughts on healthcare and education were disturbing. I mean, we know that public support for universal health care has been above 40% since the 1990s. That said, we are going to listen to the section on universal basic income because both Krugman and Klein not only demonstrate almost total ignorance of the concepts in question, but then proceed to draw the most spurious and absurd conclusions imaginable.
What's your opinion on universal basic incomes?
I don't have a strong view on UBI. I mean, I'm in favor of strong welfare state, strong social safety net. The main concern I have, I think, is that
The main concern I have is that you don't seem to understand the massive distinction between a social welfare state and a universal basic income, as demonstrated by your comment. The fundamental assumption of a social welfare state is that markets are currently and have historically set prices efficiently, and there are only a few minor deviances that the government needs to correct. Therefore, the government intervenes in minor and limited ways, things like food stamps and housing vouchers, in specific areas where prices may be failing. The fundamental assumption of a UBI is that markets have never set prices efficiently, and that wide-scale government intervention is necessary either to prevent the inefficiencies from harming individuals or to correct wide-scale and systemic inefficiencies. As I have said in previous videos, the purpose of a UBI is to allow workers to stop selling labor if it is no longer in their narrow self-interest to continue selling labor. This is a point both Krugman and Klein consistently ignore in their argumentation.
there's a little bit of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs in my mind here. Families' needs for assistance vary greatly. And UBI, which tries to cover everybody, it's a lot of money. If you're not going to be actually significantly cutting back on what the neediest households are receiving, then the whole thing is going to cost quite a lot of money.
For the good of society, we must starve the poor. Oh, how many times have we listened to that? But no, Krugman is absolutely correct, though incoherent again. Paying people enough not to freeze and starve to death is extremely expensive. Capitalists have been looking for reasons not to have to do that since the dawn of capitalism. Always we have heard the cries, slash wages, pay the workers less. The workers demand too much. We cannot afford these wages. But let's dig into numbers here. I'm not going to bother posting graphs in this video, or I may post them later, but I'm really not interested. It's been a very, very long week. A UBI of $15,000 per person would yield a family of 4 $60,000 a year to live off of. 300, let's say there's 300 million Americans. I know it's 350, but let's just keep the numbers simple. 300 million Americans times $15,000 a year comes to, I think, $4.5 billion. No, trillion dollars. $4.5 trillion. That is approximately 1/4 of GDP. Now, Why should our nation not spend 1/4 of its GDP to guarantee that if a worker decides it is not, I repeat, in their narrow self-interest to sell their labor, they are free to stop selling their labor? I mean, we're leaving no, yeah, 3/4 of GDP. We're leaving 3/4 of GDP alone. 3/4 of GDP, the capitalists can do whatever they like with, we don't care. They can speculate on Wall Street as much as they wish. They can squander it in any manner they see fit. But 1/4 of GDP guarantees to every person in our nation shelter, food, and clothing. Why is that a problem?
Now, I'm a slightly mixed feeling because I do have on the other hand, there's a lot to be said for programs that are as automatic and as universal as possible just on the political economy so that people don't have to make decisions, don't have to set rules. It's just there. I mean, the great thing about Social Security and Medicare, the question of who is entitled and what they're entitled to is extremely simple, and that has probably helped their political durability. But UBI, I don't think people advocating it have fully thought through how we're going to deal with the problem of differential needs.
Allow me to assure both Mr. Krugman and everyone listening that socialists and communists have spent decades, if not centuries, thinking through the problem of differential needs. And the conclusion we have come to is this is really a very small minority. Okay? The basic needs of all people, shelter, food, clothing, don't really vary that much. Most of the arguments regarding differential needs come down to the idea that one person wants to wear a fur coat while another is perfectly happy with a normal overcoat. One person wants to eat crab cakes while another person prefers a bowl of rice with beef on it. These aren't huge distinctions. These aren't massive or large distinctions until you really start getting into the upper levels of affluence. I mean, you might argue things like diabetes or chronic illness, but again, that's not a large portion of the population. If we are establishing a basic income that covers all basic needs, which is the reason it's called a universal basic income, then the basic needs of the majority of people are relatively the same. We can continue things like Medicaid for all on top of a UBI to cover things like chronic illness, diabetes, genetic disorders, etc., etc. But the concept of a UBI, the universality of human need, I'm actually fairly shocked Krugman is arguing this, because there's almost no empirical basis for it.
So I've been thinking about UBI a lot because I happen to be at a weird intersection of people doing a tremendous amount of work on UBIs. My wife is writing a book on it. Dylan Matthews at Vox has a lot of interest in it and does a lot of reporting on it. And one of the things I've begun to think about it is that it is hard for me in America. I think there are different arguments made for UBI in other countries and as a foreign aid tool and things like that. But in America, UBI doesn't seem to me to be a very good way of solving policy problems. If you're concerned about people losing jobs from automation, there are better, more targeted ways to solve them that would end up with the people in need getting more help.
Ezra really makes my brain hurt. Again, the point of a UBI is not a policy issue. It isn't an issue of the Federal Reserve raised rates too far and unemployment went from 3% to 6% instead of 3% to 4%. That's not what we're addressing here. What we are addressing is the systemic failure of markets to set wages efficiently because of economic coercion. It's not about policy failure. This is the great divide between people like myself and people like Krugman and Klein. They are functionally assuming that markets are setting wages efficiently and that any issues are a problem with targeted government policies or the lack of targeted government policies. That's not the point. The point is markets are not and have never and are systemically incapable of setting wages efficiently.
But a UBI makes sense. The way in which it makes sense seems to me to be much more utopian. If you believe that we've developed a society that is too much built around work, and that in a hyper advanced economy in the year 2030, 2025, whatever it might be, you should be able to have your basic needs met and spend your days doing art or spend your days playing video games or spend your days doing whatever, that you should have that autonomy. That a UBI is a way of instantiating a major cultural change.
That is a lovely red herring, Ezra. Yes, a UBI is intended to correct the fixation we have with work in society, but not because we think playing video games or drawing paintings is superior. It is there to correct the idea that having absolutely everyone sell as much labor as humanly possible all at the same time is economically beneficial to the people selling the labor.
First of all, that's a vision of the future that is far from clear. I mean, it's very far from clear that we're actually going that way. How big a deal is the robot revolution? Are large numbers of workers about to become obsolete? We can maybe talk about that again in a few minutes. The point, I think, right now is that it's hard to imagine, given the current political climate, a worse argument to make, right? If you're someone who thinks that the U.S. social safety net is wildly inadequate compared with what it should be, with what it is in other advanced countries, as I do, to say that what we need is a system that will let people who just don't feel like working not work. Oh my God, that's almost like fulfilling Orrin Hatch's dreams. I mean,
Yes, Professor Krugman, red herrings are usually very bad arguments. That's why they're fallacies. Now, first of all, again, this entire robot revolution thing, it's a red herring. I have literally never heard anyone in favor of a UBI talking about robots displacing workers. No one thinks that's going to happen. It's a fantasy of tech elites on the West Coast. It has nothing to do with anything who actually is a serious proponent of UBI thinks is going to occur. Now, I had promised you no graphs, but this is simply too glaring to ignore. Let us discuss for a few moments Orrin Hatch's wet dreams. Now, I have already stipulated that a UBI would be approximately $15,000 per person, and if we look at the graph on your screen, several things are immediately apparent. First, a single adult is going to have an incredibly difficult time living on $15,000. They're going to have to scrape by with very, very minimal access to any niceties. In addition, a single parent with one child will also be under significant economic distress. They're not going to be able to afford vacations. They're probably going to need a roommate in a small apartment. They're really not going to be living a life of luxury on $30,000 a year. Single mother with 2 children, again, is the same story. Minor improvement, not huge. However, when we get to 2 parents and 1 child, because of the cost savings in an adult is significantly less expensive than a kid, now at $45,000, we're starting to see a livable standard of living, like something someone would reasonably say, yeah, I'll take that. And the real shining jewel here is 2 adults and 2 children. $60,000 income for $55,000 expenses annually. That's a nice standard of living. That's very, very sweet. I think most people would happily accept that. Why am I bringing this up? Because the conservatives have, for 40 odd years, been sobbing, shrieking, screaming, stamping their feet about the collapse of the nuclear family. And with a single government program, we can incentivize absolutely every American to organize nuclear families. Yes, Mr. Krugman, this would be Orrin Hatch's wet dream.
It happens to be, I think, useful right now to be able to point out that the social safety net programs we have right now very much do not do that. The major programs are Medicaid, which mostly serves children, elderly, and disabled, and workers who work perfectly hard but just can't get jobs that come with health insurance. Food stamps, which is similar. Earned income tax credit, which gets at least rhetorical support from both sides of the aisle, precisely because it is tied to work. So this does not seem like a really opportune moment to be saying, yeah, let's have a program that lets people choose to produce artworks instead of working at their day jobs. I think there's some point to that. You can imagine that as a society that we might someday want to have, but maybe wait first, see whether the robot revolution actually does the things that people are suggesting it might, and then let's talk about it.
It is always amazing watching someone stare directly into the face of something and look in every single direction except what is right in front of them. Professor Krugman has just flatly stated that every single welfare program has a work component. Why do you think that is, Professor? Because work is so amazing and glorious? Because scrubbing toilets is the profound and wonderful joy everyone should be pleased and proud to have? Because flipping burgers is so incredibly awesome? No. Because the purpose of these programs is to flood the market with a surplus of labor, as we have already discussed. If we want wages to stabilize, we must stop flooding the market.
So that to me is one thing that is interesting about this debate. I think that, again, in America, UBI proponents need to be willing to engage, and some of them are, an argument that is much more foundational. Because what you just pointed out, I think, is important, but it's also not something that we should fully take for granted. The American view of the deserving and undeserving poor has in many ways been pretty damaging. And, certainly in the aftermath of welfare reform has meant a lot of people left behind. Certainly I think one could imagine a world less built around the cultural emphasis on work that we have.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we need something more foundational than the idea that when the supply of a commodity increases, its price falls. Really? But again, it stares them directly in the face and they will look any direction but the one they need to. Why do we have a culture that prioritizes work? Certainly, the workers are not benefiting. Anyone familiar with the stagnation of wages will happily tell you the workers are not benefiting. So why do we have this? Because the elites are benefiting. Those in positions of authority gain their wealth and power by the exploitation of the laboring class.
But changing that is so much harder an argument than the normal policy arguments we have. It means reclassifying who is sympathetic and who is not. It means changing some of our most foundational views. And when you add in American attitudes on race and all the different things that create resentment, American attitudes, between cities and rural areas, between the rich and the poor, it's an interesting policy as a sort of symbol of imagining a very different society. But I feel like people much too often want to make operational and pragmatic arguments for a UBI when the sort of world in which it makes sense is a much, much more shifted idea of what a state, what a society, what a rich society owes its citizens, and what is a reasonable and respectable way to live out your life.
The World Health Organization recently declared playing video games a mental disorder because so many young men in Western society have decided that what is happening on their console screen is more interesting than what is happening at their job. But Ezra thinks some massive and huge shift is going to be required to convince people that they probably should just be able to sit home and play video games if they earnestly don't believe their job is worth the amount of money they are receiving for it. No, Ezra. The people are already fully convinced of this. The elites are the problem. It is the elites who will have to change their attitude. It is the elites who will have to accept that they can either pay people $25, $30, $50 an hour, or they're simply not going to have anyone show up. It is the elites who are going to have to rethink their attitudes about merit and race and gender and work. Those in the trenches are already there.
And you might want to think a little bit. I mean, if people are going to be pushing for the notion that it's okay for some people to simply accept that they're not going to be able to get a job that's worth doing, you might want to look at other countries' experience. Britain, pre-Thatcher, actually even some ways into the Thatcher years, had an unemployment benefit system that was effectively allowed you to decide to live on the dole. It was even a song. I'm going down to Liverpool to do nothing, with my UB40 in my hand. And that ended up being a very unpopular system, even in Britain, where the politics are, much less, or at that point anyway, were much less racially polarized and so on than they are here. So a system in which you can actually point to substantial numbers of people who have simply chosen not to work. It's going to take a long, long time to persuade a significant block of American voters that that's okay.
I don't hear anyone complaining. I mean, we've been watching men meander out of the labor force for 50-odd years now. I haven't heard a single complaint. I haven't heard one single word except the men's rights movement about how horrible it is that men can't find jobs. This is one of the things that truly amazes me. I mean, look at this graph. Since the advent of neoliberalism and free trade, we really haven't moved the labor force participation rate very much at all. In fact, I don't think we've moved it more than 8, 9 points. But the total disaster this has wrought upon the American family is staggering. A minuscule bump in labor force participation, and the American middle class vaporizes. It's almost as though the only thing that held the middle class in place was government ensuring that individuals would stay out of the labor market if there were not enough jobs for them. Is that so difficult to say? Is that so hard for elites to accept? That they cannot make enough jobs for everyone, that they aren't job creators, that they've never been job creators, that they'll never be job creators. The number of jobs is what it is, that's what we have. And we need to divide them ethically and ensure those people who can't and will never be able to find a job don't adversely suffer because the elite have their headquarters buried up their hindquarters.
An interesting step down from that, though, which does focus on a cohort that we believe is sympathetic, which does focus on a cohort where there's less of a question between deserving and undeserving, is the idea of a universal child allowance, which a lot
Yes.
of other countries have. Where do you fall on that?
Very much. If there's one thing we would imagine that Americans can agree on, it is that children should not be impoverished, should not be deprived of essentials, both medical care, nutrition, and there's a lot of other stuff, because their parents happen to be poor or unemployed. Back before the election, when we imagined we were going to have a rather different regime, I was pushing for child-centered policies as being the principle, the next frontier after healthcare, because that's one where at least for now, even conservatives give lip service to the notion that children should not be punished for their parents' failings, whatever their nature. So sure, if there's a child there ought to be sufficient money for that child to have options, to have the decent things in life.
Yes, Ezra, yes, Paul, the elites can all agree that people who are too small and feeble to work, who already don't have to work and who it's illegal to force to work, should be allowed not to work. But that's not the point. The point of this is not that people get to sit around and play video games all day long. That would be nice. Good side benefit, but that's not the issue. The issue is, as I have demonstrated repeatedly over and over and over and over throughout this video, there are not enough jobs for everyone. There never have been, there never will be. And attempting to force the issue does nothing but debase wages. It is so exasperating watching two great minds stare a problem in the face and blink because they cannot accept the idea that their theories might be wrong. Now, before I leave, I had promised you 2 videos this month, and technically I made 2 videos. One of them never got posted. It's on a burner account on Gab because I used a bunch of copyrighted music while trying to explain to the admins of Star Sonata why no one was playing their game because, frankly, it is far too slow-paced. But that's an aside. Hopefully, at the start of next month, I will be able to resume or finally start publishing on YouTube 2 videos a month. This has been a colossal headache. It has seen huge delays. I am deeply sorry for not following through on my word. I really would have liked to have done this. But that said, the embarrassment of a discussion we have just seen was only the smallest part of what was a 2-3 hour interview. I may do another chunk of it. He goes into education and just misses the point completely. They are continuing to rally the wagons around education for all is the solution. And all I'm going to say in closing is that right now in the United States, less than 9% of adults go to college, get a degree, and get a job in the field they studied.